Hi guys, in this video we're going to talk about features of functions. When we look at functions, these are the features that we need to look at. The intercepts, which include the initial value and the zeros. The extrema, which includes the maxima and the minima. Maxima, when we have more than one maximum, and a minima, when we have more than one minimum. The intervals. We have four different kind of intervals: increasing intervals, decreasing intervals, positive intervals, and negative intervals. Let's start with the intercepts. We have a graph here that represents a function, and we need to identify the intercepts. We said that we have two intercepts. The first intercept is the initial value of the function, or the y-intercept. And we said that the y-intercept is the y-coordinate of the point where the graph crosses the y-axis. And in this case, it's going to be this point right here. And this point right here where the graph crosses the y-axis is 0, 2. That means that the y-intercept or initial value is 2. Now, the other intercept is called the zero of the function, and it is represented by the x-intercept. And in this graph, we have three intercepts where the graph across the x-axis. And if we look at the graph here, we have this x-intercept right here, -1, 0. This intercept right here, which is 4, 0. And this intercept right here, which is 7, 0. So basically, the zeros for this function are -1, 4, and 7. Now let's talk about the extrema of a function. We said the extrema includes the maximum, and the maximum is the greatest output or y value of a function. That means we have to look at the graph and we have to identify the maximum y value represented on this graph. And looking at this graph, we see that this point has the maximum y value. This point is 1, 4. That means that the maximum is represented by the y value of this point, which is 4. So the absolute maximum value for this function is 4. Now, we also can identify the minimum, and the minimum is the smallest output or f of x value of the function. And looking at this graph, I can see that this point is represented by the least or the smallest y value or output value of the function. This point is 5, -2. We know that the maximum and minimum is represented by the y value. That means the minimum value for this function is -2. Now let's talk about intervals. So the first kind of intervals that we're going to talk about is an increasing interval. In an increasing interval, as the input values increase, the output values increase as well. Or as the x values increase, the y values increase as well. So if we look at this graph, we will see going from left to right as the x values increase, that the y values are going up or increasing. And on the second part of the graph, we can see that as we continue with the x values to increase, the y values are going down. And on the last part, as we continue with the x values to increase, the y values are going back up again. So on this graph, I can identify two increasing intervals. The first one, I can say, is an interval that includes x greater or equal to -1 right here, and x less than 1. I am not supposed to include the x value of the maximum in an increasing interval. I can also identify a second increasing interval, and it's from that starts at x is greater than 5. Again, I'm not supposed to include the x value of the minimum. So this interval is going to include every single x greater than 5 and less than 8, not including 8 or 5. I can also identify a decreasing interval. And a decreasing interval is when the output values are decreasing as the input values are increasing, or the y values are decreasing as the x values are increasing. And in this case, on the graph, we identified an interval for which the y values are decreasing, and it's represented by the blue curve there. So in this interval, we have all x values greater than 1 and less than 5. And again, we're not supposed to include the x values for the maximum or the minimum in an increasing and decreasing intervals. Now let's take a look at the different kind of intervals. Let's talk about positive intervals for which f of x is greater or equal to 0. And in this interval, we will have input values for which the output values are positive or equal to 0, or x values for which the y values are positive or equal to 0. So if we look at the graph from left to right, we will see that as we go from -1, the first 0 of the function, as the first 0, which means y equals 0 right here. As the x values increase, the y values are positive. They're all above the x-axis, which means they're all positive y values until we reach the second 0 of the function. Now, after x equals 4, you will see that as the x values increase, the y values are negative y values until we reach the third 0 of the function when x equals 0. And now, at x equals 7, the y value is 0, and after that, as the x values increase, the y values are positive. So looking at this graph, we can identify two positive intervals. The first one is when x is greater or equal to -1 and less than or equal to 4. The second one is when x is greater or equal to 7 and less than or equal to 8. Now we can also identify a negative interval for which the input values has negative or have negative values, or the x values have negative y values. And in this case, we can identify a negative interval where x is greater than 4 and less than 7, which is the blue curve on the graph.